Yeah, and you and I have enough shadow.
I know.
I know. Yeah,
That is not something
yeah.
we need more.
That shadow self of us. Well, anyway, welcome to a short journey on my mind. It's a small crew today. It's me and Dave.
Easy to remember.
Easy to remember. And we are going to launch right into this with the idea of a fellow pastor that from California came out on Thursday and said some things about mental health that really didn't catch me off guard. John MacArthur says these things periodically. There's an article, it's well written. He's on YouTube saying these things, but he doesn't believe in mental illness, doesn't believe that OCD is a real thing, doesn't believe that PTSD or if you have a kid that has ADHD, he would say that's not really a real thing. So this really, when I read it and then watched it, I was very angry because he misrepresents a lot of what Christianity actually believes about this, I think, at least my version of that. And but Dave, where do you go with this when you, as a therapist in that world where somebody in the spiritual world says, hey, we really don't believe what you're treating is really a real thing?
Well, first let me say it's sad and infuriating that we even have to have this conversation.
I know,
but we do.
Yeah.
Because John MacArthur is influential.
Very.
And he also represents a vein of people in the particularly evangelical circles who believe similarly. And I'll talk about him for just a second before we launch into this.
But it isn't just him.
No.
There's a swath. There's a segment, right, of evangelicalism that would line up right behind him.
And I'm not saying this to bash him, but I will say when I was younger in my faith, when I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, we had a room over the garage, and the entire back wall was a bookcase.
Yeah.
So it was about 20 feet long by 7-8 feet tall.
Nice.
Full of books.
And
I had a whole section of John MacArthur commentaries. It was during my commentary phase.
Sure.
And I had John MacArthur commentaries. So, my impression of him was back in the day favorable. But since then, he has really, in my mind, and I think it's always been there, but some of his public facing statements, he disparaged Beth Moore.
Yes.
His church has been accused, I think, rightly about asking women to return to abusive relationships,
correct,
or face being kicked out of the church. He said that Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Christian,
right? And
now, here we go.
He's also associated with some parenting practices that I would say were very extreme.
Yes. So that's the context for me. Is early in my faith, kind of appreciating his work, but then more recently going, yes, some of this represents the things that I struggle with in where the evangelical portion of the church has gone.
I've, as a seminary student, had to read one of his books. Yeah. It was called The Gospel According to John MacArthur.
Oh, wow. That's pretty, it's not narcissistic at all.
And it was in response to another book that was written at the time called Absolutely Free by Zane Hodges.
Yeah.
And these two were brought together to the campus where I went to school in Trinity for a debate because they were on, and I walked away going, the one author was really gracious and kind and real interested in what MacArthur had to say, and I wish I could say the same was true of John. It didn't go that way.
Yeah.
And it was disappointing. And from that experience, it kind of tainted my whole view. I mean, his view was very reformed. It was very election driven. The other guy was very human driven. And I always land somewhere in the middle of that because I think God's involved and so are humans. And anyway, all that to say is that spiritual component oftentimes gets diluted in John MacArthur's teachings.
Yeah.
But anyway.
So that brings us up to now,
yeah,
which
where
is
we are
he
today.
had a,
Yes.
he was a speaker at a conference.
Yes.
And he made a very direct, and he's not being taken out of context.
No, not at all.
He is very clearly saying,
Yeah.
this whole area of psychiatry, psychology, and the practice of therapy in mental health is, in his words, a noble lie. And that
A noble lie.
right. Like a sort of maybe good intentioned, but a lie.
Yes.
And he makes this case that things that are accepted as real diagnoses or real mental health conditions, including OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder, ADHD, et cetera, all of them that is in fact not true. There's no such thing as mental illness. And that's what he said almost verbatim.
Right.
It does not exist.
And he would push it all into the demonic or all into
the human sinfulness.
Yes. Yep.
Right. Kind of fallen world, human sin.
Yeah. Which may be true, but it's still real. I mean, it doesn't, I mean, there is a sense of where it's broken. The brain's broken.
I want to clarify, though. I do think we're in a fallen world, but I think part of the problem is framing it as sin.
Right.
Because then it becomes, if someone's struggling with PTSD and the message is, well, this is part of being in a fallen world and it's sin, that's a beyond horrible message.
Right. It's a result of the fallen world we live in.
That's right.
Yes.
So I'm obviously, I mean,
we both land.
We land in the same place.
We couldn't both of us couldn't more vehemently disagree with his position.
Right. That's the punchline. If you want to end the podcast now, that's it. Goodbye.
But there is something to be said that from a pastor and from a therapist that would say, he's missing the value and the help from the mental health professionals that over my years, I've never seen a pastor really be able to help people with these more acute psychological issues.
Right. Yeah. And same for me. And I love pastoral counseling and pastoral care.
Right. You got a money problem, I can help you out with that.
Or a relationship problem, or a stage of life problem,
right.
Or even a habitual, like, bad pattern of
let's break your
relating or whatever it might be.
But if somebody comes to me and they are truly like if they are clinically depressed, I can pray for them, sure, and I can help them, but I can't help them to the degree that you could.
Yeah.
Or even they come to me and they're suffering from OCD. They cannot stop doing something.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can pray for them again, but it is not what you can do.
And in fact, what I would say, and this isn't a Kevin statement, but this is just, you might also not, if you were to try to enter into that, let's use OCD, you actually might give intuition, your intuition might lead you to give advice that is actually counter helpful or right. For example,
I've done that.
You might, if you don't know, it's what most people would do. So someone comes in and they're having these intrusive thoughts, and it's about, something horrible. And the tendency that people have in that example would be to reassure the person.
Yeah.
And actually what we know is the more a person gets reassured in their obsessive thoughts or similar things, anxieties like that, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
It's backward from our intuition.
That's crazy.
So, So MacArthur takes this position. He cites two books. I won't name them because I don't want to give them airtime. But one of them is really framed around the writings of a 17th century thinker.
Okay. Of course.
And
that makes sense.
Who had a really good handle on
psychology,
mental health stuff.
Mental health.
Back in the day.
Back in the 17th century.
Right. Yes. He in Columbus. And then
Columbus.
And then he also cites another one that makes the rounds, that is really denigrating psychiatry in particular, psychology to a lesser extent, sort of the framing of it being these things are created by big pharma to sell medicine, and everyone gets on medicine. And
that must be a more recent one.
Yeah. Well, they're both actually the first one is more recent book. but framed around a more ancient thing.
Okay.
But that's what he's referencing. But it certainly plays into his own already formed bias.
For sure.
Because the truth is, if we went on Amazon and we picked a topic, like let's say cancer, so I don't know if this is true or not, and we looked at the myth of cancer or how, some alternative way of framing that, there's going to be things out there in any field that are going to be counter to the prevailing wisdom. And I am all for people challenging status quo, challenging authority in those things. Good.
Right.
But really what some of those texts do is they cherry pick things, and they'll say, oh, well, medicine doesn't really help what we call schizophrenia. What helps is being in some community where they can garden and cite some evidence of that. Right. But the overwhelming majority of evidence is against that. Yeah. Being the primary way of thinking about it.
Right.
What we do know is that there are some conditions, depression in its most severe form, including bipolar, which is a form of depression that includes ups and downs that are not just
manic
normal
states.
Ups and right. Manic is like where you're out of touch with reality because your head's spinning so hard.
Sure.
And then the depressed part, OCD, etc. That these are in fact what we would rightly call disease processes of the brain. There are also other conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, which might not have a biochemical basis primarily, might be circumstantial, but are still very real.
Yeah.
And I think the problem with this is, to me, obvious. One is that among Christians that this kind of message influences, it's going to push them off of seeking the kind of help
they
that
need.
actually they need and will be beneficial to them.
Yeah.
And it's setting up this other dynamic of how mental health / psychology is at odds with and maybe even anti-Christian, anti-faith, which is in fact, we'll
pick that up later. But that's part of what's alarming to me is we make an enemy out of something that can help.
Right.
Yeah. But that's pretty typical in evangelicalism. We like to create enemies, straw men, and stand in opposition.
It's one of the glaring flaws and weaknesses of evangelical subculture is a need to always have an identified human enemy that we can sort of rally against and point to and say that they're the ones that are opposing us, so we're right to oppose them or to challenge that. The reason why it's worth us talking about this is because of what we said is, first of all, I don't think it's true.
Right.
But more important, I think it does harm.
Right.
Because there's still this vein within the church that is very, very reluctant.
Well, they're skeptical.
Very skeptical. I mean, I encounter this on a very regular basis, that people that either for themselves or their kid should have gotten some kind of mental health treatment years ago. Yeah. And there are years of suffering and years of fallout from it.
Yeah.
And they're still going, well, I don't want to do that because that's kind of voodoo. And that's sort of, it's
like ADHD or something like that. Like,
it's a great example.
Yeah. They get diagnosed through the school system or whatever. And there are ways to really help a child focus. There are.
Oh, yeah.
And
medicine for ADHD might not be the only option, but I will tell you, you put a stimulant you give a kid with attention problems a stimulant, then they're going to focus better most of the time.
Right.
Yeah. The last point I'll make, and that is, this isn't to say that psychiatry, and I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a psychiatry, but psychiatry, which is medicine.
Right.
And psychology get it always right.
No.
The diagnostic manual still has a lot of problems.
Right.
The practice of psychiatry is still very trial and error. I'm not going to dispute that.
Yeah.
That part is for sure true.
Right.
But this is an argument that throws baby out with the bathwater. It's like, yes, the diagnostic stuff is still a work in progress. The medicine piece is very hit or miss. therapy doesn't help everyone. Yes,
Sure.
all that's true.
And
But
I would
it's
say,
still real.
from a pastor perspective, the church doesn't always get it right.
Yeah.
We don't always know what we're talking about, and we talk about it anyway.
Yeah.
and with that, be curious, ask questions. Don't swallow everything you hear. Be aware, and we just want you to know that there's the other side of this as well. So, thanks for joining us on a short one.